Hi, everybody. So, for this week's Good Gig episode, I want to do something a little bit different. I want to try to answer a question, give my opinion on something that's been weighing on my mind a bit recently. And that specifically is the question of should you, as a prospective science PhD student, enter a science PhD program in the US in 2025, given the current funding climate? I'm going to go through a series of questions leading up to my answer to establish my motivation and to give you some thoughts about what my answer might have been 3 months ago. A lot has changed over the last 3 months, and I think it's a worthwhile question to spend a little bit of time on today. I think it's appropriate for my audience. So, first off, who am I? For those that have been watching my YouTube channel over the last couple of months, a channel that's focused on careers and job opportunities, you know who I am. For many others who might view this video, you probably don't. So, my name is Frank Stewart. I'm a microbiology professor at Montana State University. I run a research lab here focused on aquatic microbiology. And so, what that means is I try to understand small forms of life that live in ocean systems and also freshwater systems. And I try to understand what those small forms of life, those microorganisms, provide to the health of animals and to the health of ecosystems. I have a research lab that has 5 PhD students enrolled in the lab. They work for me, they perform research as part of my lab. And I also have 2 more senior scientists that work in the lab as well. In addition to that, I have a rotating suite of about 4 to 5 undergraduates who spend time in my lab conducting independent research or working as assistants to the PhD students or the more senior scientists in my group. I have been at Montana State for 5 years. For 9, almost 10 years prior to that, I performed and had a very similar role at the Georgia Institute of Technology, or Georgia Tech, where I was, again, a professor in biological sciences at Georgia Tech in their biological sciences department. My function was very much the same. I ran a research lab, and at both Montana State and Georgia Tech, I taught and teach classes. I teach general microbiology, and I teach an upper graduate level class on how animals interact with the microorganisms that live on their body. And I also do other things as well in service to the university. I'm a mentor for undergraduate students. I advise those undergraduate students, and I sit on a variety of different committees for the institution. And one of them is the committee that evaluates applications to our departmental graduate program. So I'm in the Department of Microbiology and Cell Biology at Montana State, and I'm the chair of the 7-person graduate committee that reviews applications by students who would like to come to Montana State and earn a PhD in microbiology and cell biology. So every year we evaluate applications and make a decision about which students would be appropriate for the program and how many to admit. I've served in that role for a couple of years now. I've been on the committee for longer than that, for about 5 years. And prior to that, when I was at Georgia Tech, I served on their version of the graduate committee for the Department of Biological Sciences. And I was not chair of that committee, but I performed very similar tasks. I helped evaluate graduate applications and effectively screened and interviewed graduate school candidates. And I also helped make decisions about the structure of the graduate program. And this is something that I also do here at Montana State. We think about the role and scope of our graduate student training and what the best organizational structure is of the program and the curricula for achieving the goals that are outlined in the role and scope for our graduate program. Our graduate program consists primarily of PhD students, so students that enter the program with the goal of earning a PhD in the field of microbiology and cell biology. We also have master's students that spend less time performing research but are equally important to the success of our department and to the endeavor of training students for science in general. With that said, I'm going to be speaking primarily in this recording about training Ph.D. students. So I want to offer a few disclaimers before moving forward. I'm not speaking in this recording on behalf of Montana State University. These are solely my opinions and perspectives. I believe my opinion is an informed opinion, given the amount of time that I've spent thinking about what a graduate education entails, and given my experience thinking about graduate admissions. And I have, again, one further disclaimer, and that's again that I'm focusing primarily on a discussion of PhD student training, not because I believe that master's students are any less deserving of attention in this moment, but the vast majority of students that I see, that I train, and that my colleagues train are PhD students. So the next question is, why am I recording this now? There's a couple of different reasons. This is the season, and I'm recording this in middle March, early March of 2025 for reviewing applications by both undergrad, graduate students, and graduate students seeking admission into a university. And in fact, we, as a graduate program here at Montana State, just invited our prospective students to Montana State for a visit to effectively interview them in person for positions at Montana State. This is the season that we typically do that. This is also the season that people work on undergraduate and evaluate undergraduate applications. The second reason for speaking about this now is that the endeavor of funding PhD training is at an inflection point. And to explain what I mean by this, I first need to describe how graduate school works. So I'm going to spend some time on that, and then I'll get into more details about why we're at an inflection point at this juncture in time. Much of it has to do with either current or what are presumed to be pending changes in federal budgetary support of training scientists at research universities and funding scientific research at research universities in general. And I'll get to the specifics of that in a little bit. This is not going to be a video about politics. This is not going to be a video about my opinion on the political circumstances at the moment in one way or the other. This is simply a video about, given the current trends in the funding climate, is this a wise or unwise time to enter graduate school? So before getting into that, I want to go over a little bit of how graduate school works for people that may not be familiar with the endeavor of training students for becoming PhDs. And that really is the purpose of scientific graduate programs in the United States. It is to train students to become experts in a scientific field, with the idea and the motivation that it takes dedicated training in both a classroom and through hands-on research to obtain the expertise that it takes to be deeply invested and knowledgeable about a scientific field. This is not something that can be done in 1 year or 2 years. It's not something that is typically achievable through undergraduate training only, because undergraduate training does not typically involve research, although in many cases it can, but certainly not the level of dedicated research that is expected by a trainee in graduate school. A level of research that by the end of the traineeship period, which is typically 5 to 6 years, depending on the type of science and the specific program, that by the end of that period, that apprentice has become an expert not only in subject matter of a specific field, but in the endeavor of doing science in general, which means things like creatively and robustly designing an experiment to rule out confounding variables to answer a hypothesis. It involves things like designing that experiment in such a way that statistical methods can be applied to lend weight or lack of weight to the outcome of an experiment. And I would say that another aspect of the apprenticeship and another aspect of what is a goal of scientific training through the PhD program is expertise in the ability to communicate the motivation and the results of a scientific experiment or a scientific study. So science communication of the importance of findings to not only other scientists, but to the general public as well. Those are all aspects of the PhD traineeship program. Training in those general skills is as important as training in the knowledge base of a specific field. And so, who attends graduate school? Graduates in sciences, and again, a caveat here is that I'm speaking primarily about graduate training in sciences, engineering, and health. I am not speaking here about PhD training in fields that I know less about, for example, fields of the humanities. But who attends graduate school for science, engineering, and health? Well, a lot of students do. There are roughly, let me double check my numbers here before communicating this, as of 2022, and I presume the numbers are fairly consistent now in 2024 moving into 2025, there are about 260,000 graduate students currently enrolled in science, engineering, and health PhD programs in the United States. So 250,000 students who are working towards a PhD in science, engineering, or health fields. That's a substantial number. With that being said, getting into graduate school is highly selective. So those students who do seek a PhD have been to some degree self-selected. These are students that have done well as undergraduates, and they are also students that in many cases have some amount of experience, familiarity with the endeavor of research. So many applicants for graduate schools have, at least, like I said, tested the waters to see if research could be for them. And it's absolutely not for everyone. Not everybody has the demeanor, has the interest, nor, quite frankly, has the level of expertise and training that it will take and scholarship that it will take to be successful in graduate school. That doesn't mean that they're not smart. It doesn't mean that they're not capable of success in many, many other fields. But someone who goes into scientific research is, it's not a single type of person, but the people that go into research share certain attributes. So those 260,000 people attend graduate school at research universities throughout the United States. And there are research universities in every state, and those research universities in every state contribute research to all fields of science, from health science to environmental science, from chemistry to physics to biology, to hundreds of other fields and subdisciplines within fields that won't be mentioned here. So graduate students span a variety of disciplines. And like I said before, it's not easy to get into graduate school. This, of course, varies depending on the institution, but even those institutions that have relatively laxed standards for admitting undergraduate students likely have not laxed standards for admitting graduate students. So as an example, we at Montana State University get approximately 60 applications per year for entry into our microbiology and cell biology graduate program for between 5 and 10 spots in the program. Sometimes that's closer to 5. The last few years, it's been closer to 5. So it's a competitive program, and this is true for almost all research universities. So the applicant pool is self-selected to be those students who have done well. They've tested the waters to be convincing to themselves that they could be successful in graduate school, but then they also have to get above a certain bar to get admitted to a graduate program. It is not easy to get into graduate school. These are the best students competing for a small number of spots. So how do they get in? The application process is somewhat similar to undergraduates. A student will submit an application to a graduate program. That graduate application will likely have a series of questions that effectively are asking the students to make a case that they're a good fit for a graduate program. And this can come through a variety of different means. This can come through conveying that that student has had some exposure to the research endeavor previously, and that they have learned X, Y, or Z from that endeavor, and that what they've learned has helped them decide that they would be a good fit for science and for research in general. Other aspects of the program or of the application involve some things that are, like I said, shared with undergraduate applications. There are typically letters of recommendation, ideally from folks that know the applicant very well, and ideally from folks that have maybe mentored the applicant in a research setting and can speak to that applicant's potential for scholarship, potential for hard work, potential for being detail-oriented, and potential for being in general responsible in carrying out what they say they're going to carry out. Graduate school is very different from undergraduate school in the sense, or very different from undergraduate training in the sense that graduate students are often doing work that is quote unquote independent. They don't have somebody over them all the time. They do not have somebody crafting their schedule for them all the time. They do not have somebody providing advice to them all the time, although they do have mentors. They are much more in a position where success is determined by self-direction. And there's a certain type of person that does well in that environment, and there's a certain type of person that does not. And so the application is designed to try to ferret that out to some degree. And so those applications are reviewed in much the same way that undergraduate applications are reviewed. For our graduate committee, for example, every single one of the applications is reviewed by every member of the committee, and we have 7 members on the committee. Then we score them based on various attributes, potential for scholarship, background, scholastic achievement, their grades, etc., test scores in some cases, although test scores are not something that we holistically evaluate across all applications. And then other aspects as well, the strength of the letters, for example, and the writing ability, communication ability of the candidate as well. And then in our program, we then, after reviewing applications, we select a short list for interviews that we conduct both by video to begin with, and then in person as a follow-up step. And these videos are crucially important for getting a sense of a student's potential fit for the program and a student's interest in the program. And then finally, the last component of the application that's critically important for graduate school is, in many cases, a student making a case that there is a particular researcher, a particular faculty mentor at a graduate program that has an interest in that student and that has space available in their lab. And so this is the way graduate school works. In some programs, students will come in and rotate amongst labs before deciding on a lab, but in many other cases, a student will come in having already established a relationship with a prospective faculty mentor who says, I want you in my lab. I think you'd be a good fit, your interests align with mine, and you're an overall impressive candidate. And that's critically important, making that connection during the application process. And that's usually something that a student does by reaching out and saying, hey, these are my interests. This is why I think your lab is amazing, or at least aligns well with my interests. Can we have a conversation about whether or not you have space in your lab? And I'll get to what that means in just a second, because it relates to our overarching question about funding. So that's critically important in applying for graduate school. These are students that are not only excellent, that have a background that suggests high scholarship, and an application that suggests high potential for moving forward, but they're also students who have a relationship with a prospective faculty member. Not in all cases, not all programs operate that way, but many do in the sciences. So once a student is in a program, they can go through a variety of different steps in progressing through the program. In those programs that are focused on students that come in and do rotations, that first year or year and a half are devoted to a student moving between different labs and conducting research, short projects in research in each of those labs to get a sense of what that lab does and to get a sense of whether or not their interests align well with that lab's interests. In programs where a student comes in and works directly with somebody, they may start research right away in that lab, and then the expectation is that they stay in that lab. And so what else happens in graduate school? Aside from that distinction between rotational students and non-rotational students in the first year, the first 2 years are often devoted in part to scholarship in the classroom. So just like a student would take classes as an undergrad, a graduate student is expected in most programs to take graduate level classes, to become an expert in certain techniques and certain knowledge bases, and to do that in part, at least by learning from experts in the classroom and having scholarly discussions. And those classes are very much like undergraduate classes, except that the rigor and the expectation of the graduate students is a little bit higher. They often have more work per unit of time than an undergraduate who may be taking the same class. So students take classes in science PhD programs, and that is usually something that is relegated to the first 2 to 3 years of the program. Ideally, a student gets his or her classes out of the way and then devote the rest of the time during the program to solely conducting research. The expectation, at least in many cases, is that a student will begin conducting research as soon as he or she starts the program, so in concert with taking classes. So those first couple of years can be very busy for a student. They may be taking a full class load. It's not often the case that a student will take 4 or 5 courses in a semester as a graduate student, but it does happen, while also thinking about the type of research that they want to do, the specific questions that they want to do, maybe even apprenticing in certain other labs to get expertise and techniques. All of these types of training steps can happen in the first couple of years. And then the remainder of the program is really focused in most cases on that student conducting an independent research project. By independent, I mean it's their brainchild. They have conceived of an idea, not to say it's an idea that doesn't have input from that person's mentors, but it's an idea that should originate from the scholarly mind, from the creativity, from the critical thinking of that student, because the goal of scientific training through a PhD program is really to select for those students that have those critical thinking skills, that can conceive of novel ideas and design an experimental plan to go after those ideas. And so it really is a selection process. Not everybody makes it through the program, through a PhD program, and that's why, at least in some degree, these programs exist. They should be selective. They should be selecting for those individuals that are best fit for the endeavor of science, not only from a knowledge-based perspective, but really from the perspective of leadership and those other skills like critical thinking, like creativity, like experimental design, like logic, like statistics, things along those lines. And that's not something that necessarily is always predictable by simply admitting a student. That's why a program can select out certain students. But that's done through the research endeavor. And so a student's progress through the graduate program often has milestones. Those milestones can involve a comprehensive exam, which often tests critical thinking skills, knowledge base. This is something that's often administered by a committee of faculty members to that student in both oral forms or in written forms, and that often takes place in the second or maybe into the third year of the program. And then the deliverables downstream of that can vary considerably amongst programs. Sometimes a student is required to give regular updates to the department on a yearly basis or even a semester basis. Or sometimes there may not be deliverables along those lines. A student may simply conduct research and then work towards a written dissertation of that research, which would then be presented to the department or the scientific community kind of writ large at the end of that student's trainingship. Um, Sometimes that thesis deliverable, that dissertation deliverable, is benchmarked by certain publication goals along the way. In other words, a department may specify that in order to achieve a dissertation in a field, you need to have first published 1 to 2 to 3 papers um, of reporting the results of your independent research along the way to that dissertation. And those papers are scholarly papers. They're peer reviewed. They are papers that suggest to not only that student's immediate community, but to prospective employers that student is somebody who has not only conceived of an idea, but they've executed it and communicated it to effect. And the typical goal for a PhD program is about 2 to 3 papers for a student. And I think that's relatively consistent across disciplines. And so all of that happens during graduate school. There's the in-classroom training. There's the scholarship that happens in the research lab or in the field or in front of a computer, depending on the discipline. Not all research involves wet lab work. Certainly much in the health sciences does, but there's a lot of fields that do not involve that. And so a student is working very, very hard during graduate school. There is not necessarily a boss that's in there with you all the time, judging whether or not you arrived at 8 and left at 5. The rigors that kind of surround a structured work day in other industries or dimensions of employment are not necessarily in place in graduate school. They can be, depending on how a lab is structured, how an individual mentor structures his or her lab, but they may not be there. And as a consequence, a student has a lot of independence in structuring their own day. And that's good and bad. A bad thing is that a student often ends up in graduate school working many more than 40 hours per week. I certainly did in graduate school. My work day did not end when I left at 5. It ended usually around 8 or 9 o'clock after I left Starbucks after basically working on the computer for a while. And so that's very typical. It's also typical that a graduate student will come in on the weekends or after work to finish an experiment, to start an experiment. These are not things that can necessarily be constrained to a given time frame, at least constrained well to a given time frame in all cases. So the punchline here is that students work very hard during graduate school. It's often more than 40 hours a week. And the expectation is that they're more or less treating it as a job. Yes, it's a traineeship, and some of that traineeship involves going to school, but they're also doing research to get trained. And that research involves generating products that are useful to the lab, useful to the university, useful to society as well. And so they work very hard. Do they get paid for this? Yes, they do in most cases. In most cases, a science PhD student will get paid. They're working on a stipend. And this becomes important in just a sec. And that stipend is effectively a salary for them. It's not a great salary. It's often a very modest salary. The typical graduate student in the sciences receives about $25,000 to $40,000 per year. In many communities, that's barely enough to pay the rent. That was certainly the case in my experience in graduate school. I kind of went in knowing that I would need to have roommates, and I did. My roommate ended up becoming my wife. And this is often the case for many schools. Many universities are often in places that are relatively more expensive to live in, and the graduate stipend certainly does not cover that, which is a concern in many cases, but it's a manageable concern. And so the students do get paid, and where does that money come from? So that money comes from almost exclusively federal funding. So when grants are administered to faculty members at research universities to do research, the bulk of the money for those grants goes to paying for personnel in a research lab. And that is typically graduate students or other levels of the scientific hierarchy, things like postdocs, which are individuals that have received a PhD and are now at a stage where they're just doing research before moving on to a next step. So federal funding is the primary mechanism by which a graduate student receives that barely livable wage to support themselves during graduate school. And it's a substantial number of students that receive federal funding. And I'll put the references that speak towards this data on the screen as after I post this. But the estimate that I saw is that 84% of PhD students receive either full or partial federal support, and that has been the case for a long time, and it's the case now. There are a subset of students that do not get paid through federal funding. That subset of students could be individuals that get paid through a private foundation. In other words, a private foundation has provided a research grant to a faculty member at a research university, and they use that research grant to support their PhD students in the same way that that faculty member would use a federal grant. Alternatively, a student may pay themselves, if you will. That's probably not the right way to say it, but they're working in some other dimension to get paid through mechanisms that don't involve a research-based salary. And so what I mean by that is that many students will teach during graduate school. They will work as teaching assistants or TAs for classes that are taught in graduate school. They may lecture in the class. They may work to administer the labs associated with that class. They may grade papers, etc., and they get a salary for that effectively is their stipend. The problem is that there's a limited number of TA-ships for usually for the number of students that would benefit from having a TA-ship. So they cannot be offered to everyone. There's simply not enough positions in classes as teachers to support a student's stipend solely through teaching. Thus, the need for funding for some through some other mechanism. It's also possible that students can receive funding through other means as well. Some students receive scholarships through, again, private foundations that are not necessarily funding the entire research endeavor, but maybe funding a student's salary. There are ways to get that additional funding, but the punchline here is that the vast majority, 84% of students receive their living wage, their support through federal grants. But they do get paid to go to school and to do research. And what do these students do after they graduate? So that's a great question. The PhD training program in the U.S. is the primary mechanism by which we feed the most highly trained scientists into the roles that scientists perform. And we find scientists in kind of every dimension of society. Roughly 50%, and I'll post the link to the study that describes this. Roughly 50% of PhD students in the U.S. After graduating with their PhD end up working in industry. And that can mean a variety of different types of industry. That can be biopharmaceuticals, that can be other aspects of the healthcare industry, it can be manufacturing in a variety of different contexts, especially for engineering students. The definition of industry effectively meets everything that you can think of, including the agricultural industry. There are many PhD students, for example, that go into supporting companies like Monsanto to think about creative ways that we can understand biological systems to grow crops better or to fight pests better. That's just an example. But 50% of students who graduate with a PhD go into industry. This has certainly been the case for students that have come into my lab and exited my lab. Almost all of them have gone into the biotech industry, often working for healthcare related firms. I do work on the microbes that live in association with animals, and the techniques that we use are often extrapolatable to thinking about microbes in human systems. And so many of my students go on to work for companies that are thinking about how we can understand the microbes on our human body to better utilize them for our health. That's just an example. But most of my students go into industry, and this is true for most PhD students. This is the mechanism by which we produce PhDs, highly trained participants in the scientific endeavor in the United States. There really is no other way to do it. An undergraduate who has a degree in science can certainly go and work for industry as well, but they will not have the same level of expertise that somebody that has trained themselves to be a critically thinking PhD ready individual will have. That doesn't mean that they can't get to that space, but like I said before, the PhD program is also designed to selectively winnow out those students that simply don't have the potential to be the leaders in the scientific endeavor. And the PhD training program is really designed to prepare those leaders. They can go in a variety of different directions, but that's one of the key goals of the program. The other 50% of PhD recipients go in a variety of different directions. Some do not stay in science. Some go into other fields. I have a friend who I went to graduate school with. She got her PhD ahead of me. She decided not to stay in science. She went and used her expertise in science to go into business instead. And so that's often the case. Many PhDs will go into business applications that are not necessarily applications where they use their research training on a daily basis, but they use their knowledge of science more broadly to inform business decisions, for example. Some will go into government positions. There's many government research labs that support and employ scientists to do work that is useful for the government, and this spans all agencies within the government, including the military enterprise. Many PhDs will go in and be employed by things like the Department of Defense, for example. And then some PhDs, if they can find a job, will go into academics. It's not so easy to find a job in academics. There are far fewer jobs than there are qualified applicants. Every time we conduct a faculty search for a new professor, for example, you may expect hundreds of applications for one position, and everybody who's applying has a PhD, and they've kind of self-selected to be a highly qualified applicant pool. But that's a route as well. But most PhD students do not go into academia. Most go into the private sector. This is the way we train scientific experts to be productive in the private sector. Doesn't mean that all research happens at research universities. That's certainly not true. Much research happens in industry, but it happens through PhDs who have been trained in academic institutions who have then entered industry. This is the mechanism by which we feed scientists into the economic enterprise that kind of fuels many aspects of America. And so that's what PhD students do after they graduate. Okay, that's a lot of background. I want to get to the point that I'm here to address. But I do think it was necessary to kind of provide some context for thinking about graduate school, for thinking about what it means, and for thinking about how participants in the graduate or the PhD training endeavor get funded. And so I'm going to ask this question of, should you, as a prospective PhD student, go to graduate school? And I'm going to answer it offering two perspectives. My perspectives from about 2 to 3 months ago, and my perspectives now as we've entered into a new funding climate that is that may be challenging, will likely be challenging to the endeavor of research-based science in universities. So should you go to graduate school? And I want to caveat my answers to this, at least with one caveat now and then some more to come. But my first caveat here is that I'm speaking and answering this question from the perspective of a student who has already determined for him or herself that they are a good fit for research. So I'm not here, the purpose of this recording is not to speak to whether or not X, Y, or Z would be things for you to consider to determine if you are a good fit for research. I'm going to make the presumption that you've tested the waters a little bit, you know how research works, you have the personality type, the cognitive abilities, the responsibility to be a good research scientist, and you are motivated and want to do this. So I'm going to make that caveat and answer it with that caveat in mind, that you've already answered yes to that question. So if someone were to ask me three months ago, should you go to graduate school? With that caveat in mind, my answer would be absolutely yes, right? For many different reasons. And I'll just go through a few of them. The first off is that the research enterprise is extremely rewarding. It's one of the only opportunities in my mind, in my opinion, where the sole kind of benchmark and objective is truth. In my opinion, this is one of the most beautiful enterprises in the history of, of society and kind of human endeavor to begin with. Can we try to figure out how the natural world works, how our constructed world works to the best of our ability, giving the most evidence that's possible for us to accumulate, and can we weigh that evidence appropriately to be confident in an answer? I think for that reason, I think the research enterprise, at least at that very large general level, is something that can provide a lot of personal reward, if you think of it that way. It's an endeavor whose values align with those of many people. It's a worthwhile endeavor to be trained to continue that way of thinking for the rest of your life. Other reasons that I think you should go to graduate school. We need science. Almost every aspect of our modern society and our past societies has been built to some degree on discovery, innovation that has come from the scientific endeavor, from the way we grow our crops to be more efficient, from the way we treat human diseases, from the way that we make compounds and structures safer and stronger, from the way that we deal with pollutants in the environment, from the way that we communicate over the internet or satellite. All of these discoveries are based on that Ph.D. training wheel that our country has been operating successfully for over 100 years, if not more. We need scientists, and this will not go away. We have pressing societal and scientific and health challenges that need to be met by experts who know the field, but also know how to critically think their way through problems in the field to arrive at solutions. And so we need scientists. That need will not go away. The next reason I believe that the answer should be yes, at least 3 months ago, is that graduate school can be a lot of fun. This is not universally the case. Everybody has a different experience in graduate school. Everybody has a different experience in life. But you're surrounded by people that are there for the endeavor of truth. You are surrounded by people who are often very multidimensional. They could probably be successful in most arenas, but they've chosen to focus on research and science, but they have a lot of other interests. They're often very well balanced. They appreciate work-life balance, and they likely appreciate you and your perspective. It's not always the case. Science is a human endeavor. You're going to get people that you don't want to be around, and you're going to get people that you would love to be around. But in most cases, it's a good group of people, and a supportive group of people. And it was, for me at least, a lot of fun. I enjoyed the enterprise. I had a supportive mentor. I left the experience feeling that I grew as a person, and also grew scientifically. It can be a lot of fun. It's not a time where you're going to make money. It's not a time where you're going to become rich. But it is a time that prepares you well for taking the next step that is usually one that has high job security. So PhDs, at least in the biological sciences, which is my realm, are highly employable. Like I've said, most of my students have gone into industry, and they've often found jobs months ahead of when they graduate, and they step into those jobs, and they're paid well, because their expertise is highly valued, and it took a while to get that expertise. Not everybody has it. And so they have skills, they have knowledge bases that have real pragmatic value for industry, or for other endeavors that they go into. So they're highly employable. You do sacrifice 4 or 5, maybe 6 years of not making a lot of money, but you can recoup that after you get a job. And like I said, most PhDs will be able to land a job relatively quickly. So the job security is high. And again, I'm speaking only about the science, engineering, and health fields. That may vary depending on the type of PhD traineeship that we're talking about. It may vary with the humanities, and I suspect it does. But most PhDs are highly employable. So graduate school can be a lot of fun. It's an endeavor in pursuit of something that I find highly rewarding. I mean, what can be more rewarding than being the first person to try to understand how something that previously was not understood, how that something works, to be the first person to make that discovery, to make a discovery that can potentially be useful for society and in ways that you may not even be able to foresee. How can that not be rewarding? It takes a lot of hard work. It's not easy to be a graduate student. It's not easy to obtain a PhD, but it can be highly rewarding. And it can also set you up well for taking those next steps. There are many positions that are offered, advertised by companies, by government labs, by other arenas that are not open to individuals that do not have a PhD. Right? There are many positions that you cannot step into unless you have a PhD. Right? So, for all of those reasons, should you go to graduate school? My answer 3 months ago, absolutely yes. Again, it's a biased, caveated answer. And again, it's caveated by the fact that you've already decided that research is good for you. But if it is, it's a great way to spend some time, and it'll set you up well for both critically thinking for the rest of your life, but also for a position that is likely going to be financially viable for your life, right? Okay, so that was 3 months ago. The answer was absolutely. So now I'm going to give you a little bit of background about what's happened in the past couple of months, and then provide an answer to should you go to graduate school. My answer being now, in early March 2025. So what's changed in the last few months? I'm not going to go into too many details here, but the basic punchline is that federal funding of scientific research is it's really facing an unprecedented cut, and potentially exceeding 50% or even more, maybe even 100% in some scientific arenas, either now or in the next, presumably in the next few months or years. And this is due to proposed decreases in the federal budget allocations to various scientific agencies. And this really, at the moment, is spanning the gamut. The proposed cuts to scientific funding are likely to impact everything from the National Institutes of Health to the National Science Foundation to the Department of Energy to the USGS to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, or NOAA, to NASA, to protect potentially even the Department of Defense, although it's probably more likely that the Department of Defense may experience fewer cuts, if any, at all. But all of those agencies that I've mentioned before provide financial support to the university research endeavor. And I mentioned before that the vast majority of that support goes to paying the personnel to do research towards the goal of obtaining a PhD, but also towards the goal of moving the research endeavor forward, right? So they're being paid to do research to address specific problems. The U.S. funding of that research comes primarily, as I've said before, through the federal government. So as of now, we're looking at between, I'm just going to estimate it here, between 20 to 75% budgetary cuts for the primary major federal funding agencies that support the university research. This is likely to be due to direct cuts to the budget itself, but also changes in how grants from the federal government to universities allocate money to what are called direct costs versus indirect costs. And so direct costs is the money that the government may give an individual university and a researcher at that university to actually do the research, to pay the people a salary, to buy equipment, to buy supplies, which are very expensive in almost all forms of research. And then the indirect costs is a proportion of the direct costs that is taken by the university to effectively provide the support network for doing that research, right? And so that support network can be as simple as making sure that the buildings and the spaces in which that research is done are safe, are there. In other words, keeping the lights on. And it can also go towards paying personnel that support the research at more generally. So these can be people that help university researchers navigate things like safety protocols or the process of applying for grants in general. There's a whole suite of things that are supported by these indirect costs. These are things that are effectively, like I said, the buttressing, the infrastructure that allows research at a university to proceed. It's all these costs that are not directly associated with a lab per se, but of the institute itself to allow that lab to operate. And so every grant has a proportion that goes to direct costs and indirect costs. And so there's a proposal to effectively decrease the amount of money that goes to indirect costs from the government. It remains to be seen what size of that decline in indirect costs will actually be. But there have been some estimates of a roughly 50% decrease in indirect costs. And universities are always kind of operating on a scalpel budget to begin with. So a decline of 50% is substantive and substantial. And so those two mechanisms, declines to proposed budgets for scientific funding agencies and then changes in the direct cost to indirect cost structure, are likely to have dramatic effects on how much money is coming from the federal government to support the training of the scientists that fuel the scientific endeavor in the United States. And we're starting to see some kind of preemptive moves by universities to get out ahead of that looming decline in budget. It's not necessarily fully implemented yet, but it's presumed to be coming through the proposed budgets that will be coming through Congress. And those kind of preemptive steps are things like reducing the number of students that a graduate program is likely to admit for the upcoming year. As an example, some universities have already started doing that, or they have retracted offers of admission that have already gone out to prospective PhD students, effectively saying that the budget climate has changed and we can no longer offer you a spot. And other things have happened as well. The universities are trying to adjust their books at the moment to figure out how they can deal with a decline in indirect costs. Can they find other ways to support those very essential costs that underlie research? If not, the research endeavor really is at risk of disintegration. Universities are trying to get out ahead of it. I think it's a substantial problem. It's one whose kind of most immediate impact, given the fact that most federal support goes to paying the people. Therefore, the most immediate impact will be a decline in the participation by individuals in PhD traineeships. There will simply not be enough money to pay the same number of people to become trained as scientists. There will simply not be enough money to sustain the same level of research that those trainees are involved in, to pay for the supplies that they use to run experiments or to collect data or to analyze data. And that has, just stepping back here, as an individual who runs a research lab that employs, as I said at the beginning, 5 PhD students, 2 other more senior scientists, and who employs those individuals largely through federal funds. As someone in that position, I am reassessing, recalculating, rebudgeting how I am going to move my research forward, and specifically to support those individuals over the next few years, knowing that there's a huge amount of uncertainty at the moment about whether or not I will be able to, 2 things, compete for federal grants and obtain federal grants to support those individuals. The uncertainty is at an unprecedented high. And we all calculate, or at least assess, some amount of uncertainty every time we think about whether or not we could invite somebody into our lab to participate as a PhD trainee. At no other time before have we faced the potential for such large cuts. That doesn't mean that we cannot adjust and deal with those cuts, but it does mean that we need to recalculate the training of our PhD students and to reassess the viability of that that traineeship over the 3 to 5 year period that it typically takes for a student to obtain a PhD. There's so much uncertainty that, even in the best of times, that we have a hard time budgeting 3 years in advance. Now we have an almost impossible time of budgeting 3 years in advance, let alone 5 years in advance. So those moves that are being taken by universities at the moment to scale back entrance into PhD programs, I think, are going to become more universal. And these are moves that prospective PhD students should absolutely be aware of. Every single faculty mentor who runs a research lab at a university in the United States is thinking about this at the moment. This may vary to some degree based on how much research that they do, but if it's a large lab that supports a variety of different people, has multiple projects on the table, they are absolutely thinking, how do I keep my people fed over the next few years? That's what's changed over the last few months. And so that, I think, by necessity, forces us to rethink the answer to this question. Should I go to graduate school if I'm a prospective PhD student? Someone who has finished their undergraduate, someone who has tested the waters, confirmed that research is for them, that science is for them, that they want continued training, they want to become an expert, knowing that in the US, really the only mechanism for doing that is through research training at a university, not through research training on the job at an industry. Our system does not work that way. We don't yet, maybe this could be an adaptation in the future, we do not yet have an industry-based method to becoming a scientist with the level of training that is typically achieved through a university setting. That could change. That could be one of the ways that we adapt. But we're not there yet. We haven't built that system. And so taking all of that into consideration, this is my answer to the question of, should you, as a prospective PhD student, go to graduate school now, in 2025, knowing what we know in March 2025 and knowing the uncertainty of March 2025? And my answer is yes. I think you should. And these are the reasons that my answer is yes. The first off is that we still need scientists. They fuel our societal, our technological innovation through the research that they do, first during the PhD traineeship, and then secondarily as they enter into whatever the arena that they enter into, industry, for example. Our PhD traineeship program is that mechanism for innovation in both the private sector and the public sector, and that's not going to change. If we want to stay competitive as a country, if we want to stay competitive in technology and innovation, in societal well-being, in health management, we need PhD scientists. Every aspect of our modern day circumstance is in some way or at some point was dependent on innovation that came through our educational system. We need these scientific experts. And right now, and this is the second reason you should do it, we don't have another option. We do not have another option for selecting and training the best and the brightest scientists. It simply does not exist. Like I said before, industry can train individuals on the job, and this can be useful. But the PhD program also operates to select those that are most capable for this endeavor through that extended traineeship, apprenticeship, a period where they're working many, many hours a week to hone their skills in critical thinking and knowledge. And this is something that does weed out some individuals to reach to select for those that are most capable of being productive on the job. We do not have another system for doing this in the United States. Like I said before, this may be one of the ways that we adapt to deal with funding constraints. I'm not saying this is the only system that needs to be in place. We're humans, we can be flexible, we can find new solutions, but this is what we have now. So why else should you go? The endeavor and the reasons for enjoying the endeavor of doing research at a university are not going to change, at least in my opinion, fundamentally. You're still likely to be surrounded by great people. You're going to be working on important questions. You never know what you're going to find, which is incredibly exciting. You could be the first person to discover something new, to discover something that can change maybe not the world, but maybe the world. And that's amazing. And the university is the infrastructure that allows that to happen, which is incredibly compelling in my opinion. So that I don't think is going to change. There may be some changing opinions and emotions around the endeavor, but the endeavor itself, as conducted through the university, is going to be fundamentally positive. And I think that's something to consider. The other reasons why you should say yes is that I assume that most of the students making this decision are relatively young. You're still young. Your whole life is ahead of you. Our scientific climate, our funding climate will change. Everything, if there's one constant in society, it's change. And I suspect that the pendulum might swing in different directions over time, over the course of your lifetime, because you're still young. You're probably considering this question at the age of 22, 23, maybe in your later 20s if you've done something between your undergraduate and your decision to go to graduate school, but you're still incredibly young. We'll still need scientists 10 years from now. We'll still need scientists 20 years from now. And again, we only have at this point, one major mechanism for producing those scientists. Building off of that, you're still young. So how much would you really lose by trying? Given that there's a lot of uncertainty, how much would you really lose by spending a year, 2 years, maybe at the most, testing the waters? And I give the 2-year time frame as kind of like the maximum duration over which it might take to really figure out if there's funding viability for the duration of your PhD. But presumably, you'd probably learn that even sooner. Like if you enter into a PhD program now, and by now I mean, let's just say fall or summer 2025, you give it 6 months, I think you'll have a much better sense of where the funding climate is, a much better sense of your personal financial responsibilities, of the lab's financial viability. You'll just have a better sense of things. And if the conclusion you reach during that time is that your position is likely to be tenable over the long term, then great. If it's not, if the funding climate is completely dried up, if you do not see a path forward, at least a path forward in terms of supporting your research or the lab supporting your research, then you've lost 6 months. You've lost a year. Think of it as a gap year. Think of it as testing the waters, acquiring skills that will be useful for you, critical thinking skills, maybe technical skills in the laboratory or in the field. Think of it as having made a network, or at least a portion of a network that could be useful for next steps, having met somebody who can write a strong letter of recommendation for you after working with you for 6 or 12 months. What would you have really lost if you step down this path? Again, with the caveat that you think it's good for you, you think it's a good fit for you. What would you really lose if you had to diverge from that path 6 months, a year, even 2 years from now? You're still young. You can go in a multitude of other directions if you need to diverge off of that path. I think those are important considerations. I think the endeavor of scientific research at universities is going to change. I think that it is less likely that we will be able to support the same number of trainees across the same number of disciplines. Universities will have to adapt. Our method for training the best and the brightest scientists will have to adapt if the funding climate stays the same. But we can adapt. We're humans. We're smart humans. I think we can find solutions, especially if we partner with other arenas, industry, for example, to think about creative ways to both train and select for the best and the brightest. The need for your expertise, for your motivation, for your passion is still going to be there. Say yes. I think there's a lot of uncertainty, but that's okay. I will end, however, even though my answer is yes. My yes answer comes with some substantial caveats that speak to the magnitude of change that we're dealing with here. Again, the first caveat is that you've already made the determination that you know or are reasonably sure that you're a good fit for graduate school and for research. Other caveats to consider or assumptions to put into place is that there's funding for at least a short period of time. I don't think you want to go into a PhD traineeship at this moment if there's not at least money for 6 months, for a year. That should be there. I think you should feel emboldened to ask those who are interviewing you or considering you as a mentee. You should feel emboldened to ask them directly, do you have funding for me for at least a year? Some may say, I have funding for you for 5 years. And this is true for certain programs. Certain graduate programs at certain schools have deep pockets. They have money that they can use that are associated with other pools at the university, and they can draw from to say, I'm going to give you a lot of confidence over the next 5 years that you do not have to worry about being funded. That's the minority of cases. However, most research universities cannot promise that. They will not promise that. But many universities should be able to comment on whether, and many programs should be able to comment on whether or not your funding is secure for 6 months, for a year. I would want that if I was in your position and thinking about going into graduate school. I don't need to hear I have funding for 3 years or 5 years. I'm willing to test the waters for a year and then diverge my path if need be. The other caveats that you just need to remember are that this is a risky environment and it's a risky decision from a financial perspective. We're in an unprecedented funding climate. This may change in one direction or another direction. But you should know that funding over the long term is not guaranteed at the moment. And I think this is universally true across PhD programs in the United States. We're simply uncertain. Departments are uncertain, institutions are uncertain, individual faculty members are uncertain. That's okay, we're going to work through it, but there is that uncertainty, and you should not bury that in the sand. And I think another caveat is that you should probably think about a plan B. If a year from now funding is dried up, you can no longer stay in your program, what would your next step be? Give some thought to what that could look like. Give some thought also to how what you're doing now in this 1 year testing period, this 1 year gap year during which you've started a PhD program, give some thought to what the skills that you learned during that time could be used to take you to the next step. Think about ways that they set you up or things that you could be doing as a first-year PhD student to set yourself up should your path need to diverge. Look at those skill sets that could be particularly valuable. Skills in data analytics, for example, in statistics, for example, in bioinformatics, for example. Try to find some opportunities during your first year to get training in those specific areas. And there's going to be many others. I'm just throwing out some examples here. Training in some very pragmatic skill sets that will lead to actionable steps forward in a career path, things that are highly valued in society. And there's a lot of stuff involving data analytics and AI and bioinformatics that you could acquire in a relatively short period of time as a PhD student and use those as marketable elements of who you are should you need to get off that path and go in another direction. Other caveats to remember is that your mentors, the people that you're going to be working with, the faculty that you're going to be working with, are equally uncertain about what the next steps are. And I already made this point before. But they're going to be dealing with that uncertainty over the next period of a year or more, if not much longer. And keep that in mind. They may not be able to provide you answers at this point about the funding climate. You should ask, as I said before, but they may not be able to answer or provide a definitive answer. Keep that caveat in mind. But my answer is yes. We're in an unprecedented period of funding change, an unprecedented period in change in the value and really the global knowledge base of what scientists do and what the scientific enterprise is all about. I think attitudes towards that have shifted. We're at an inflection point, but we still need scientists. We still need experts trained at the level of a Ph.D. to be critical thinkers, to be innovators, to be the leaders that it will take to keep society, technology, and humans healthy and happy. So I'm hoping that all of these words that I threw at you, this perspective is useful. It's only a perspective. It's an informed perspective. I think I have some amount of credence in offering this perspective, but it may differ if you talk to another faculty member or talk to another individual. Again, this is not the perspective of anybody else, not the perspective of my department at Montana State University. It's not necessarily the perspective of Montana State University. It's simply my opinion on where we stand. So I hope you take it, and I hope you can use it.